and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we are taking a look at some more Italian cars. We begin with the 2017 Ferrari GTC for Lusso, 680 horsepower, 514 foot-pound torque, 4,233 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, the torquiest car here today, and the heaviest car here today. It is the Scuderia's second attempt at a all-wheel drive car after the Ferrari FF, which I didn't like so much. The GTC for Lusso, on the other hand, I do quite like. It's got a proper four-wheel drive system now. I think it looks pretty darn good, a hell of a lot better than the FF did, which looked kind of awkward. This does look purposeful. And out of all of the modern Ferrari range, this would be the one I would buy. I've always preferred Ferrari's GT cars. I like the all-wheel drive, I like the way it looks, and yeah, it is a pretty darn compelling car, it has to be said. So, as far as it goes to driving Forza Motorsport, then what have we got? Well, it's a disappointment. Sure, speed is great, acceleration's fantastic because it's got all-wheel drive and a big V12, however, the handling is pretty poor. It is very, very understeery. A lot more understeer than you expect. This is one of the most understeer heavy cars I've driven in a long time. The only things that stand out this vividly is stuff like Nissan GTRs and the Porsche 911 GT2 RS, and that could carry way more corner speed than this. Yeah, quite a disappointing car, it has to be said, and if you do go to drive it, just be aware of that. Next up, we have the 2010 Lamborghini Murcielago LP6704 SV, 661 horsepower, 487 foot-pound torque, 3,850 pounds of weight. The Lamborghini Murcielago, an end of an era. The final Lamborghini designed mostly with Lamborghini technicians on board. The SV was the final evolution of such a car. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the SV. I've discussed this before. It's a little bit too overlooked for me personally. There's too much carbon fibre, too many grills on the back, too big a win. I'd personally stick to the more contemporary LP640. In that, guys, I think it's a fantastic looking car. Don't get me wrong, the SV still looks good and I'd freak out if I saw one, but for me personally, I'd go with either the standard car or the LP640 from a look standpoint. From a driving standpoint, however, the Murcielago is understeery again. Not quite as bad as the GTC for Lusso, although that was pretty darn harsh, so maybe my opinions on that have been drawn out. Yeah, understeer. The gear ratio is very long on this as well. I only used 3 or 4 of the forward gears, I think. First gear goes up to 75 miles an hour, which is quite horrific. Other than that, though, it is quick, it accelerates fast, it does drive relatively well. I like understeer, though. Although it doesn't drive quite as good as the newer Aventador. Next up, its smaller sibling, the 2011 Lamborghini Gallardo LP570-4 Superleggera, 562 horsepower, 398 foot-pound torque, 3,470 pounds of weight. It was not quite the last Gallardo, however, it is one of the more recognised of the Gallardo nameplate. The Gallardo, the first baby Lamborghini that didn't flop. This car actually equated for 50% of Lamborghini's lifetime sales by the end of its production run, which is pretty incredible. The Gallardo, a car I wasn't a huge fan when it first came out. It was very Audi influenced, however as time's gone on I've warmed to it a little bit, especially with the facelift. I think really helped make this car more into a proper mad Lamborghini. And I mean, I can't really help but love the mid-mounted V10 engine. As far as the Gallardo goes to drive, the best way to think of this is it's like driving a mini Murcielago. It doesn't understeer quite as badly, however it doesn't quite have the acceleration and speed that the Murcielago has. It isn't that far behind in those two attributes, but the handling is definitely a lot better. It is a lot less. Sure, there is understeer still there, which is kind of obvious because it's a powerful all-wheel drive car, however, yeah, it is a hell of a lot better than the Murcielago and the GTC for Lusso to drive in that regard. Next up, a much older supercar, the 1982 Ferrari 512 TR, 421 horsepower, 360 foot-pound torque, 3,690 pounds of weight. This is the evolution of the original Ferrari Testarossa, one of the supercars of the 80s that sticks out in the whole vaporwave aesthetic sort of crowd, this and Countach of course. The 512 TR was the 1991 evolution of that, although this car definitely still looks like it's firmly in the 80s. Powered by a 4.9 litre Boxer 12-cylinder engine, 421 horsepower, not all that much these days, but back in the 91 that was fairly impressive, I guess, even if the GMC Cyclone definitely wasn't far off, and much more impressive than the pitiful Ferrari 348 with its 300 brake horsepower. As far as the Countach goes to drive, well, I mean, you know, it's obviously more a car about looking at it. These days, again, it's not much to write home about. This is a top-of-the-line C-Class car in this game. which, yeah, considering that's where sort of sports saloons and hot hatches of these days sits, that tells you much of what you need to know. It is a bit of a disappointment. It's an alright car to drive, don't get me wrong, but usually these mid-engine supercars from this era are usually much better to drive than this. It's a little bit more wallowy than, say, an NSX. It doesn't quite have the punchy power that you'd expect, but yeah, certainly usable, and nowhere near as bad as the horror stories you've heard about driving Tesla Rosses before. Next up, the 1992 Alfa Romeo 155 Q4, 187 horsepower, 219 foot-pound torque, 3,064 pounds of weight. Alfa Romeo's a legendary saloon. This thing dominated touring car circuits all across the globe when it was in its prime, in typical Italian, slightly rule-breaking fashion. I believe they even put a V16 in one of these to put it in front of a Formula 1 crowd at one point. It was mid-engined. It was a crazy thing, but yeah, a very, very cool Alfa Romeo 155. I don't know anyone who could hate the 155 and its sort of slab-sided nature. Definitely better than the 75, which we also have in the game under its American name that I've forgotten at the moment. But yeah, they're definitely a better car than that in my opinion. This one, of course, also has four-wheel drive, which means, well, considering this is our third Italian all-wheel drive car of today, fourth, sorry, what can you tell from that? Well, it's understeery. Not much though, I've got to say. It drives pretty well, but yes, there is understeer here, even at 187 horsepower. It is soft. It also has to be said the suspension's a bit softer than you'd expect from a modern vehicle. However, it's a pretty smooth car to drive. Sort of, yeah, very communicative, easy car to drive. That's definitely a way to say it. Very forgiving. And yeah, you know, you put a few upgrades in this, which is what you probably should do, and this thing becomes very, very quick indeed and a lot of fun. But yeah, even in its base form, a decent car to drive, if a little bit understeery. Next up, we have the 1965 Alfa Romeo Giulia TZ2, 170 horsepower, 130 foot-pound torque, 1,367 pounds of weight. This is tied for the least torquey car here today, and it is almost certainly the lightest car here today, 1,367 pounds. That is not a lot. Of course, it is a race car. What I can find on the Giulia TZ2 is this participated in early sports car racing, endurance racing, stuff like that. They built 12 of them. And yeah, it was a pretty cool little race car. And, you know, it's just a treat. You know, it's an old Alfa Romeo sports car. How can you not help but love it? It looks a little bit frightened of itself, I've got to say. But yeah, definitely quite a good looking car, and one that I was very incredibly excited to drive, because 170 horsepower and 1,400 pounds sounds like a hell of a lot of fun. And it has to be said, it is a good car to drive, this one. A little bit soft, as you can see, but then again, it's from 1960. The only real downside of this car is the braking performance, which I find to be very lackluster. Considering its size, you'd figure this thing would be able to stop very well, but it just doesn't. The brakes do feel a little bit left behind, so swap those out for some race brakes, and yeah, I'm sure you could make an absolutely fast track rocket leaderboard climbing machine out of this thing, and even out the box, yeah, it's a great fun little car to chuck around. Next up, oh boy, the 1975 Lancia Stratos HF Group 4, 265 horsepower, 202 foot-pound torque, 1,918 pounds of weight. The legendary Lancia Stratos, the car that ran riot over the Rally Championship because it was one of the first cars ever built purely for use in the Rally Championship. V6 Ferrari motor in the middle, very short wheelbase. It's, yeah, of course a car that is a classic these days, and yeah, I like the Stratos. It's kind of mental. I do much prefer it in its rally trim. I'm not a huge fan of the way the road car looks. I think it looks very bare, but you know, this version with the full fog light package and the yellow wheels, hell yeah, I'm well on board for this thing. How does it drive? It drives like an absolute animal. This thing is fun and absolutely terrifying. You won't go very quickly in this, I've got to be honest. The suspension is incredibly wallowy. The rear end constantly wants to meet the front end to have a handshake. And yeah, the brakes aren't particularly good, but there's a decent amount of power in this, and it is a huge amount of fun. This is not a car you drive fast around the track. You can see how much it leans on the braking there. This is a car that you just throw into corners and have a huge amount of fun with. Definitely the most fun car here today. And yeah, definitely an interesting car, has to be said. And finally today, the 1980 Abarth 131, 140 horsepower, 130 foot-pound torque, 2,161 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful car here today, and of course it was tied for the least amount of torque with the Alfa Romeo Giulia TZ2. The Abarth 131, a bit of a forgotten car in the realms of Forza. This has actually been with us since Forza Motorsport 3, I believe. It's a car I quite like. You know, its boxy shape is definitely appealing, very much an Italian Ford Escort as per se, and this car actually did pretty well. This is another sort of rally homologation special built by Abarth. This thing actually won the 1980 WRC driver's title. I can't remember the name of the guy that drove it, but was it Walter Roof? I think it was. Yeah. So it did pretty well in rallying, and you can definitely tell it's a little rally racer. This thing with a good couple of upgrades again. Again, that's sort of been the theme of the last few cars in this segment, is just, you know, these cars upgraded would be a hell of a lot of fun, and out of the box they're pretty decent as well. This thing, good, solid, yeah, can't really complain. It drives better than its contemporaries, I guess, as you'd consider them for this game, the Ford Escort and the Vauxhall Cadet GTCE thing. Definitely drives better than those two. And of course it has that Italian flair to go along with it and the boxy styling. Some may think it looks a bit like a Lada, and that's not too far away from the truth, but yeah, definitely a fun car to drive, and it comes in a bunch of silly colours, as all Italian cars should. Onto the leaderboard then, and our quickest car today was the Lamborghini Murcielago, going in 68th place with 158.868, which beats out a Ferrari F40 and a Lotus Elise GT1. Just behind that, however, a Lamborghini Gallardo, 71st place with a 115.923. Very, very good time for the baby Lamborghini, very close to the Murcielago, and it does beat out the 430 Scuderia and the 458 Italia. I've said it before, I'll say it again, I would definitely rather have a Lamborghini supercar over a Ferrari supercar. Next up, in 89th place, we find the Ferrari GTC 4 Lusso, 117.284. Does beat the Ferrari FF by a fair considerable margin, but just not a particularly impressive car beyond that. Gets beaten out by cars like the SLS. Does beat out a Nissan GTR, and they are kind of comparable because they don't drive particularly well. Moving down the board once again, in 111th place, we find the Lancia Stratos HF Group 4 with a 119.121. Honestly, that car could have gone quicker, but trying to drive it quickly is just a real hassle. Very hard car to drive, but a pretty decent result considering it, and definitely shows up some more modern sports cars. In 198th place, we find the Ferrari 512 TR with 122.818. Actually pretty good, beats out an Aston Martin V8 Vantage V600. A modern day Porsche Cayenne. Does beat out the Honda NSX, which I actually recommended the NSX over the 512, but I'd assume the 512's got slightly more straight line speed. In 212th place, we find the Alfa Romeo Giulia TZ2 with a 123.344, goes in between a BMW Z3 M Coupe and a Holden HSV W427. Not all that much to compare it to around there, but a pretty decent time considering that car is from 1965. Going down once again, in 411th place we find the Alfa Romeo 155 Q4 with 130.796, beats out a modern day Abarth 124 Spider, a Vauxhall Corsa, beats out a Nissan Skyline GTR SR of relatively similar vintage as well, so yeah, pretty impressive shot from the Alpha 155. And finally today, in 455th place, ironic, we find the Abarth 131 with a 133.500. Yeah, good time, beats out Ford Capri, Fiat Dino, which is all sort of contemporaries for that car. Yeah, very good time from all of the cars here today. They've all done pretty well considering quite a few of them are fairly old. Anyways, thank you all very much for watching this edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. Do hope you've enjoyed. Join us next time for the Rivals episode, which is going to focus on V12 GT cars, and they're going to be facing off, so that should be a very loud episode. And then come back for the next main episode, which is going to be featuring cars from the rest of Europe. Cars that just, I didn't have enough cars from each country to fit them into their own episodes. They sort of got lumped into rest of Europe. So join us for that. Until then, farewell.